Welcome back to the Bar Hall at the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival protected by Dettol. Today, our session is Bihari Satsai, Rupert Snell in conversation with Harish Trivedi. The Bihari Satsai is a work of the early 17th century by the poet Biharilal in Braj Bhasha. The Satsai was written in the court of Raja Singh of Amer near Jaipur. The poet was rewarded with a gold coin for each verse. 700 verses were compiled into the Bihari Satsai, which has been considered an outstanding representative of the Riti period, weaving together worldly experience and divine eminence, and adapting the writing style of court poetry. Rupert Snell's translation for the Murti Classical Library is scholarly yet accessible and brings alive the tradition for the modern readers. In conversation with fellow scholar, academic and translator Harish Trivedi, he speaks of the enduring legacy of the Bihari Satsai with its evocative romantic imagery and visual vocabulary. Rupert Snell has studied, taught and delighted in Hindi and its literature for half a century. In retirement from academia, he contemplates the aesthetics of certain favorite works and has books forthcoming on the Ramcharitmanas and on autobiographical writing in Hindi. He is also drafting a novel by a fictional pupil of Biharilal. Harish Trivedi has taught English at the University of Delhi and modern Indian literature at the University of Chicago. He has published in the areas of comparative literature, translation studies and post-colonialism, and is a contributing editor of a project based in Stockholm for writing a history of world literature. Please do remember to comment by typing it into the comment section. Ladies and gentlemen, we now present Bihari Satsai, Rupert Snell in conversation with Harish Trivedi. Over to you, Harish ji.
Rupert, it's such a delight to be together on this occasion.
Yes, indeed.
You and I have known each other for 30 odd years, if not 35.
Yes.
And I was a bit miffed to find that you had met Biharilal even before you had met me. Because from the introduction that you in this book, I find that you first came across Biharilal, the poet, in 1973 when you were a student of Hindi at the SOAS in London.
That's correct, yes.
That's about 50 years.
Yes.
Lifetime, more or less. What's been going on between Biharilal and you this half century?
Well, I was drawn to the text very strongly at the beginning because of the obvious playfulness of it, actually. I thought it was I noticed a lot of punning and this kind of feature in the poetry, which engaged me very strongly. And that I've almost entirely moved beyond, I think. It's no longer that aspect of it which pleases me. In terms of translation, I've been through many, many different approaches. I've tried rhyming couplets. I've tried a kind of haiku style minimalism. I've tried all sorts of different things. And in fact, when I was preparing yesterday for this conversation, I noticed in reading the book, which has just come out, that I no longer agree with myself in every aspect of that. And, you know, the translation is something which is not a static thing. One has new feelings about things and new approaches and so forth. So the book that's come out, which I'm very pleased with, it's beautiful to be within the Murti library because they produce things so beautifully, and the editorial support is just fantastic. That is a kind of snapshot of my view of Bihari, which is committed to a book, but isn't necessarily the final version.
So we'll have the full portrait in oil some other time.
That's right.
This is a snapshot. You know, I wanted to tell the viewers, which will be evident as soon as they pick up the book, that Rupert's Hindi is phenomenal. Not only modern standard Hindi, which he has also translated from, but Braj Bhasha and Awadhi both, which most Indians who call themselves Hindi speakers have no clue to. Richard is a past master at all. In fact, I was very surprised when he got a job at the University of Texas at Austin, because they require a near native competence in the language, which Rupert doesn't have. What he has is a supranative competence in the language, because most natives can't match it. And Biharilal is reputed to be one of the most difficult poets in the Hindi language, partly because he is so compact, so full of figures of speech like pun and alliteration. And he is altogether notorious, almost, not only famous, but notorious for how much he packs in just two-line stanza. So how do you unpack all this in your translations?
Well, you start with the hardest question of all. And I think it is, in a sense, mission impossible. You know, you cannot really capture every nuance of the original. Certain things, such as very specific moments in the poetry, like punning and alliteration that you've referred to, you really can only achieve, I think, by a process of substitution, by which I mean to say that you don't try to translate that pun or that particular play, but you just make sure that the language that you do use is in its own terms punning, elusive, playful, musical, and so forth. So I have generally not tried to emulate the original in terms of those specifics, but I try very, very hard indeed to make the language, the English that I'm using in translation, to make that playful in its own right, so that something of that ethos comes across.
Do you agree that Bihari is one of the most difficult poets in the language to translate? And is that the reason why so many, even in Hindi without translating, so many commentators have chosen his work? More than 50 people have offered full commentaries on that text. What do you think of these commentaries, and how far have you gone to them? In what ways to help you translate?
Yes, I've used a number of the 20th century commentaries, if that's the right word for them. They're not perhaps tikas in the traditional sense, but more scholarly approaches in a modern genre, really, to the text. The most famous, of course, is the Bihari Ratnakar, which is the standard commentary from which others take very large amounts of information. And that's, as I say, a kind of standard work, very, very helpful, sometimes a little bit over imaginative in terms of its etymologies and things like that. But yes, I've used these commentaries quite widely. I think in terms of the translations which have come out in English, of which probably the best known is that by K.P. Bahadur in Penguin, it's still in print, is that many translators focus almost entirely on the narrative of the poem. So they're determined to tell the story and to explain the characters and to sort of pad out the motivations and the causalities and so forth. But it becomes very unpoetic when you take that as your sole focus. So I've tried to go the other way and rather leave some of the contextualization and so forth to the reader to imagine, as indeed Bihari did. You also mentioned the fact of the compression of the couplets. I mean, that's something which is really hard to deal with. And if you wanted to capture every last detail, you know, you would have an enormously long poem. I mean,
that's why you invented a new stanza form, not of 2 lines, not of 4 lines, but 3 lines, which works out.
Yes.
Yeah, which works out in practice, I found, very often to 2.5 lines. You don't need all 3.
That's right. That's right.
How did you arrive at that?
Well, I started off, as I mentioned earlier, I started off by trying to translate them in couplets. It just doesn't work. You can't do it. There's just too much information to put in 2 lines of English, because English is very space greedy. It needs its definite and indefinite articles. You have to state the pronouns. You have to put in a lot of stuff which Bihari left out.
It
And
sounds
so,
inferior to Hindi.
oh, very much so. Yes, absolutely. Of course. We both know that.
Yeah, I've been teaching the wrong language, and you have been teaching the
Absolutely.
right
Absolutely.
language.
Yes, yes, yes. So then I tried to use a standard kind of quatrain, a four-liner. But there I found that some of the couplets didn't really have enough material for that, and they became very wordy. And so then my next attempt was completely in free verse, letting the lines flow as much as they wanted to. And that too I found unsatisfactory, because part of the point of Bihari's poetry is its concision, and also connected to that, the fact that it's in an extremely fussy set meter with which there is no possibility of variation. I mean, it has to be bound within this doha, sorta format.
Yeah.
So I felt that the translation had to have some nod towards the fact that, you know, here is a set meter. It's a particular form which is followed throughout, regardless of the subject matter. And that's why I kind of hit upon the three-liner as being something which is ideal in length. And as you say, it's not necessarily 3 full lines at all, but it appears on the page as a sequence of 3 lines of varying length. And I found that the easiest, well, perhaps the most efficient way of unpacking the couplets. Some of the other English translators, who have all done, you know, wonderful things with the text in their own way, allow the lines to run on almost ad infinitum. I mean, in some of Bahadur's translations, for example, there are more lines in the English than there are words in the Braj.
Well, expensive translation.
Yes.
Poor English language.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's not the way to go. One has to be concise, like Bihari, and yet 2 lines may not be enough very often.
That's right. And the other thing with the question of lines and the sort of management of lines, I find that too many of the English translations, which are multi-lined, if I can use that expression, are really just prose split up into small chunks. There doesn't seem to be any, I was going to say rhyme or reason, that's not the way of putting it. There seems to be no particular justification for when a line ends and when a line starts. It just follows the syntax more than anything. And that's fine, but it's rather prosaic. It's a little bit Philistine in a way. It doesn't seem to be very poetic to me.
Yeah. Rupert, as you said in the beginning, I perhaps began in the wrong way by asking you the most difficult question,
Yes.
which is about the process of translation, the nitty-gritty
Yes.
of translation,
Yes.
and the joy of inventing a new
Yes.
form in translation.
Yes.
Now, let me make up by going to some easy questions,
Oh, good.
which are about what the poem is about.
Yes.
You know, Satsai means 700 verses.
Yes.
He actually is supposed to have written 719.
Yes.
You have chosen 400 out of
Right.
that,
Yes.
for the reason that he lived 400 years ago. I like that joke. But was there any other criterion which you adopted in eliminating 300 verses?
Well, that is not an easy question, actually. As usual, you wrap up difficulty with ease. Honest answer is that it's pretty subjective. I decided that I felt myself that the text was fairly uneven in terms of interest and quality, and that the best way of presenting the poet was to be a little selective. So I had translated all 714 or 19 or whatever it is, but I was not particularly interested in quite a large number of those in terms of my English translation. So it's partly to do with what works in translation, partly to do with the inherent interest of the poem itself. So it's a record of my own failures, maybe, that there are 400 rather than 700. But I think it's a more, how should I say, a more satisfying collection than a complete 700 would be.
Yeah. And, you know, in any case, the English reader is not likely to miss them. What kind of a reader do you visualize for this?
I thought
What
you'd
kind
come
of a
to me.
reader does the series visualize, the multi-classical library?
Well, I think the library itself is seeking to reach readers who may not be at all familiar with or expert in texts of the kind that the library presents. It's certainly not a kind of specialist Indological readership that's envisaged. Even quite simple things like names are glossed and translated. The footnotes, such as they are quite sparse. There's not a lot of explanation. There's certainly not a kind of academic or stylistic discussion of each poem. So it's the general reader, I guess, who's being really addressed by this series. And I've tried to bear that in mind. One of the interesting things I found in discussing the nature of my translations, particularly with Sheldon Pollock, Shelley, who is the overall editor of the series, was that the series is very much aiming to have a kind of translation that will last, that will endure, that isn't of the moment.
Yeah.
And it rather turns its back on some of the stylistic approaches that I had originally used, such as a little bit of archaism here and there. The translation is supposed to be in modern language. Excuse me. And so I had my wrist slapped occasionally for various kinds of inversions and other things in the language, which brought in the kind of archaic touch that I was interested in using, because after all, it's an archaic poem. But so that the language is more modern than I would naturally have used. Again, in terms of addressing the modern reader. But
Indeed.
as I say, sorry?
No, go ahead.
But as I started off saying, you know, I'm reasonably satisfied with what I've done. But on the other hand, there are all sorts of other ways of doing these things. And for that purpose, I need to quote some verses of his in couplets. So I've had to retranslate those ones in couplets for the novel.
Yeah. So you're going back and to and fro even now, back and forth, to and fro.
Yes.
Experimenting with forms is still a live text for you and not a closed one.
That's right. That's entirely right. Yes.
What I wanted you to talk about now is what the poem is about. It seems to be taken for granted that in many ways it's a bhakti poem.
Yes.
But there are freestanding stanzas.
Yes.
Which have been shuffled. The order has been shuffled by various editors.
Yes.
So obviously there's no sequence, and it may be too much to hope for one thematic unity throughout the poem. There are many kinds of poems. Some seem a bit didactic, telling people how to conduct themselves. Most are love poems. Some are attached to Radha and Krishna, because Bihari happens to stand, in terms of literary history, at the cusp of bhakti and riti. The great bhakti period is just coming to an end. The riti period, which will go on for 200 years from his time onwards, is about to begin. And right at the beginning, he sets a tremendous example. Now, what I found very interesting in your introduction was, very early, in the first paragraph, you say that the poem is about love and beauty and the victims of love and beauty.
Yes.
What is that?
Well, let me try and address some of the things you just said. I mean, I agree with you that there's a big question about the extent to which it's a devotional text. It certainly has many poems which fit into the bhakti kind of ethos. It certainly has a number of poems in which Krishna and Radha are named as the protagonists. And there are certainly the didactic poems that you've mentioned, which often have a kind of religious, dharmic kind of approach to them. But the way I see it primarily is that it's a kind of conflation, if I may use that word, of the Krishna Radha narratives with the kinds of narratives that we find in love poetry of much earlier centuries, in particularly the Prakrit Saptashati and those other texts from the early...
The form is the same as the Saptashati, 700
yes.
verses. Yes.
Yes, yes. So following, I mean, at some point, probably not Bihari himself, but somebody else has compiled his verses into a 700 format. But even the themes themselves are very close to and often imitative of the Prakrit poems. So those, of course, were written well before the narrative of Krishna and Radha came to the fore, which is really a question of, well, for Krishna, the Bhagavad Puran in probably the 9th century, then for Radha, the Gita Govinda of 12th century.
Yes, Radha was born only in the 12th century, because and Krishna
be careful what you say.
With the Gita Govindam by Jayadev, and
yes,
Krishna has been there forever. But here in this poem, Bihari seems more focused on Radha. He begins by invoking Radha at the beginning.
Yes.
Is this, as we say now in fashionable terminology, does it make a woman-centric love poem?
No, I don't think it does. I don't think I don't think that it goes so far into the matter of the poems themselves. But you're right. There is a verse which is the first verse in almost all recensions, which is addressed to Radha in the same way that a poet might typically invoke Ganesha at the beginning of a poem to remove obstacles from the task that lies ahead. Well, at the time that Bihari was writing, Radha-oriented sectarian activity was very strong in the Braj. One has only to think of things like the Radha Vallabh Sampradaya,
that's right,
which I have worked on earlier, to see that kind of ascendancy of Radha. I think that more or less takes care of the reason why Radha should be there in the ascendant in that first poem.
I found it, I just noticed it recently. I've known that verse, opening verse, ever since my school days. It was taught me in the classroom.
Right.
But I just noticed that Bihari addresses Radha as Radha Nagari.
Yes.
While the word Nagar or Nagari is associated traditionally with Krishna.
Right.
The sophisticated, urban, elegant one.
Yes.
Natwar Nagar.
Right.
But here it is Radha Nagari.
Right, right.
Does Radha continue to be Nagari throughout the poem?
Oh, yes, I think so. I think that's I mean, it's a hard word to translate, as I've just noticed you didn't translate it in your English question. I think that I ended up calling her the courtly Radha for the word Nagari. It has to have a sense of sophistication, although urbanity doesn't quite hit it, although that's the literal, it's the literal translation, but it's the wrong register, you know, so it doesn't work. But something to do with a kind of courtly sophistication and artistic, sublime, beautiful, a kind of rust-filled sense is there in Nagari. So yes, that is the way that she's portrayed. Although I have to say that it's only in, as I said earlier, it's only in a small minority of the poems that it's clearly Krishna and Radha as Nayaka, Nayaka. A lot of the commentaries being sort of swayed by the general feeling that, you know, much early Hindi literature is Vaishnava in approach. They read Krishna and Radha onto the text without them necessarily being there, which is fine.
Yeah. I found this discussion, a discussion at this point in your introduction, quite fascinating, because you identified that only a very small proportion, you say I think about 10%, are directly addressed to Radha Krishna.
Right.
But the other poems also have the same emotional ambiance, they have the same tone, they have the same Suchi Sringar, as it has been said in this context.
Right.
A kind of not too physical amorousness.
Yes.
A chaste kind of amorousness, which can be sublimated. by some readers to mean what they like. But I found one suggestion by you very interesting, and I think an original one in all the scholarship that surrounds it, which is that when you transfer a kind of not divine, but as you said, sublime meaning or dimension to the poems which are not about Radha and Krishna, you also invoke the nirguna, the abstract.
Yes.
That I found it so new that I do not quite know what to make of it. Because if it is nirguna, then how can it be represented through two human beings?
Well, I mean, there certainly are poems which, yes, I mean, the range goes from very quite explicit descriptions of physical lovemaking, you know, with the details which are so often there in traditional Indian love poetry, like even talking about sexual positions and things like that. So it's quite explicit in certain ways within, you know, within certain parameters. But on the other hand, suddenly you drop into a poem which is, yes, nirgun and feeling. And there's a sort of creative playfulness, I think, in terms of using a kind of nirgun approach, but making some kind of saguna story out of it as well at the same time. So there's a kind of crossover between the two, as there so often is actually in poetry, you know, that these are not two distinct, entirely separate categories, but things which play off each other in a creative kind of way to make one realize that there is no one satisfactory way of describing the divine, and that sagun and nirgun descriptions of it are two complementary routes to the same destination. But yes, the mixed content of the Satsai, what I find really appealing is that you can have as a whole sequence of poems descriptive of the female form, or that sort of subject, or of love in separation, viraha. And then suddenly you're hit between the eyes by a couplet which is really to do with the immanence of God, quite suddenly, out of the blue. And that juxtaposition makes it a very lively text to read, because you never know what's coming next. Yeah. And although it would be quite possible to translate the book, the collection, thematically, you know, ordering the poems in such a way that you stayed within one theme for a certain period and then moved on to another one, that would kind of destroy the ethos of this mixed content, I think.
Yeah. No, I found that fascinating, and the way you put that in the introduction and the way you lead the reader to expect that as he goes along into the poem. As you just said, a number of dohas, a number of couplets here just describe physical beauty in a very sophisticated, courtly sense.
Yes.
Beginning right with the second couplet. After Radha, immediately he goes into a description of ordinary human heroines who are in the prime of their youth, Joban and Nirpati. Yes. Now, does this have a precedent? A kind of general unnamed woman whose beauty is being described at such length in such a variety of ways? And is that one element that makes it courtly? Because then there is direct pleasure to be had without any bhakti coming into it, for the king for whom he's writing, for the fellow courtiers, and for the fellow poets.
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, I think that is an aspect of the courtliness of the poetry, is partly to do with the who was the patron at the time. We see this also in the paintings, because as you know, the genre of paintings that run alongside the poems themselves is very well established, and you have extremely beautiful renderings in paint of these same narratives. They're not necessarily very close. How can they be close? How can you emulate those individual words and tropes and so forth in painting? but in terms of emotion, of bhav, they are directly related to these poems. So yes, I think one that kind of speaks to this dichotomy of theme as well, that, you know, we move from one theme to another. These are poems to entertain, and one way of entertaining is through appealing to people's devotional sense. I think what comes out very clearly in poems of this kind is that there's an absolutely close connection between aesthetics and spirituality, that the aesthetics can be harnessed in order to achieve spiritual aims or spiritual views of life. So I think it's that's a very important point in poems of this kind, that the aesthetic power of the poems can be put to devotional use, and sometimes it's specific and sometimes it's just suggestive.
Yeah. How would you respond to the suggestion, which you yourself half make, that beauty described in such classical terms, in such elevated terms, enhanced terms, can have a sublimity of its own without reference to the divine?
Without specific reference to the divine, perhaps. But I think, I mean, in terms of suggestibility, I think the divine aspect of things is never very far away. Bihari is extremely cunning and knowing about the way in which he uses imagery to be elusive, to make suggestions about things. And he has, I don't ask me to quote it because I won't be able to from memory, but there's a couplet in which, for example, he talks about one of his favorite themes, which is the developing body of the young heroine, the Juliet, as it were.
That's right. That's right.
And how the form of her breasts can be just subtly discerned under her clothes, like the meaning of a poet underneath his words. And that is a very playful and tongue-in-cheek and very Bihari-esque kind of statement to make.
That's right. It also goes back to Sanskrit. There are so many echoes of Sanskrit in all these Ritikal poems.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I wanted you said you cannot quote from memory. Leave that to us Indians who learn by rote.
Yes, yes.
But why don't you pick up the book? This is the book, the copy that I have.
Yeah.
And I must say for all viewers that they have been published by the Harvard University Press, but is available in India due to the special arrangement that the publishers have with that series for a very reasonable price of about 300 rupees or 350 rupees, something like that. I got mine free, so I would not know.
Well,
but read out one or two stanzas, one or two.
I must say, one of the things that pleases me most of all about this publication is the fact that it's available in India. It's come out, I think it's a paperback edition in India, correct?
Yes, I have a paperback.
Yeah. And that is just wonderful, because that's where the natural readership is, and I would hate it to be just locked away in kind of Western libraries, you know. So I'm very, very happy about that.
Yeah.
Well, you put me on the spot by asking me to read something, but you had given me notice of this, so I can't complain. So this is a couplet about the sweet complexion of the heroine, the Nayaka. If you want it to be Radha, then it's Radha. If you want it to be...
Why should I?
Yes. If you
Radha
want
is only for Krishna.
So if you want it to be somebody else, if you want it to be Gita or Neha, then that's also perfectly possible.
Sure.
So the trope here, this is 395. The trope here is that a rose petal falls on her cheek, and because it shares exactly the same qualities of her skin, nobody perceives that it's there. So that's the kind of narrative here. And the Braj says, Bananabasa sukumarata sabavidhi rahi samai, pankuri lagi gulab ki gal na jani jai. And I've translated that is in my 3-line format like this. Alike in fragrance, hue, and tenderness, a rosy petal falls upon her cheek, and no one knows.
The rhythm you achieve, the cadence you achieve is most remarkable.
Well, I worked hard on that, and also
that really sounds like verse, like verse, looks like verse, and is verse. Yes.
So there are various aspects of the original poem. It has alliteration with and a sort of playfulness of language. So I've tried to. I haven't rhymed it, but I have used the word rosy, a rosy petal, which alliterates, which falls in with the word nose. So there's a kind of internal rhyme going on there. This is something that I've tried to do throughout the poems. And yes, I've played around endlessly with the wording and the rhythm, the music.
That's right. Now, this reminds me of another element that probably goes into Bihari's poetry subliminally, which is the Persian influence.
Yes.
The gulab is not native to India.
Right.
It comes from Persia. And this doha reminds me most of all of a couplet by Mir Taqi Mir. Nazuki uske lab ki kya kahiye, pankhudi ek gulab ki si hai. The same image.
Yes,
How
yes.
can one describe the delicacy of her lips? They are like the petals of a rose flower.
Right,
Now,
right.
apart from that, in the very second stanza of Satsai, there is Persian word, ijafa, izafa.
Yes, yes.
Right, so the ijafa. Are there any other subtler Persian influences?
I don't. There's quite a large Persian vocabulary, but then we find that throughout. You know, the poets of that era were very Catholic, if I can put it like that, in terms of their vocabularies, their lexicon. They take words from all over. Even
Tulsidas and Surdas have them.
Tulsidas, indeed. I mean, Tulsidas uses the word. I was just looking at this yesterday for other reasons. He uses the word sahib in the Ramcharitmanas 11 times.
Garib Nawaz for Ram.
Yes, yes.
Garib Nawaz.
Right.
It is the limit. Yes.
In Bihari, I think the Persian words tend to be to reflect a kind of courtly usage. For example, a lot of military terms, weaponry and things like that are Persian words. This is something that he would have found in his environment at Amir, where the close connection to the Mughal court would have been felt very strongly. And yes, there is a kind of openness towards words which of whatever source they may be. There's a lot of Sanskritic vocabulary, there's a lot of Persian vocabulary and so forth.
We have only a couple of minutes left, I think.
Yes.
What I'd like to do is two things. One is, not only are you looking at Bihari over and over again, I understand you've started a novel.
Yes.
Which the hero is a disciple poet of Bihari's, and he composes verses of his own.
Yes.
And you are having a whale of a time composing verses on his behalf, because I think that disciple to Bihari should be named as Rupert Snell. I don't know what name you've given him. And before you read out one of his verses, fictional verses, and one couplet by Bihari that you omitted to translate,
yes,
says Uttarot Sathot Sattarottar bhi Uttarottar Anand Labha ho aapko, which translates as in life there is plenty even after 70.
Yes. Well, I was very keen to do this conversation while I was still in my youthful 60s. I didn't want to risk turning over into 70 because who knows what might happen.
Just in time, like Phileas Fogg. So, now read a Kundaliya.
Well, so what's happening here is that the first couplet of this 6-line form is by Bihari, and then the 4 lines that follow are by his disciple, by me, as it were, expanding on the theme. So which one shall I? Yes, there's a lovely poem in which Krishna's darkness is partnered with Radha's fairness.
Oh yes, when they walk in the lane.
They walk in the lane, and when there is moonlight, Radha disappears, and when there is shade, Krishna disappears. So they're both partially seen, which is also a kind of devotional statement in a way.
That's right.
So I'll just read the English translation. So I've translated the Bihari couplet like this. One body blends with shadow, one with moon. 2 souls are one, as lovers roam the lane. And then it goes on. The lane they roam, now shaded, now as bright as heaven's night lamp lending limpid light. For Krishna's dark, in moonlight seen or sun, and Radha's fair and gleams when day is done.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Good luck with the novel.
Thank you.
And we also look forward to reading your selections from Ramcharitmanas in translation.
Yes.
And
so I'm working hard on that.
I somehow get a feeling that in your 70s, you're going to be a bit more productive than so far.
Well, I'm free from
Good luck with all that.
Free from the burdens of university life. That's very
Exactly. I know the feeling. Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
To have this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rupert Snell and Harish Trivedi, for that very, very interesting conversation. Thank you for being part of this session. We thank our celebration partner Diageo for their support and all of you for being such a lovely audience. Please do stay logged on to continue to watch with us the series of exciting sessions featuring a stellar list of speakers that have been specially curated for you. Do remember to buy a copy of the book from the bookstore Amazon online. And in case you do want to indulge in some retail therapy, you can check out our merchandise partners, Earth Fables. Please do also remember to tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2021 and tag us at Jaipur Lit Fest. The festival is protected by Dettol. Hope to see you in our other sessions in the 2 venues, Darbar Hall and Front Lawn.